Welcome to Series 3 of The Great Humbling. What does it mean to be humbled? Perhaps it's to be less proud, to feel less important, even a little defeated. From the Latin humus, ground, to be grounded, and humilis, brought to the ground, made low or lowly. My name's Ed Gillespie, and I'm a poet, futurist, and recovering sustainability consultant. In the early days of the pandemic, I started recording these conversations with the author Dougald, where we wonder together about the strangeness of the times we're in, the altered states into which they push us, and now, in this third series, the new moves that might be called for, if these really are times of being brought back down to earth. So, here we are, episode 8. The end of a third series from what is now the Old Cobblers and the Mill of Impermanence. How's the feedback from last week, Dougald?
Wow, a lot of rich responses. Thank you everyone who's been in touch since last week's episode when we were talking about prayer. A lot of people have told me how moved they were by that conversation, and it feels like a very generative episode. Matt Osmond, whose essay we talked about, wrote a long and thoughtful response on Facebook to what he described as the strange experience of hearing the two of us musing aloud about words that he'd once written a pandemic ago. And he wrote very humbly about how little use the insights in that piece have been to him in the time since. This is not to disown a single word of what I said, he writes. But he goes on, prayer is not a clever thing to do, thank God. Whatever else it may be, prayer's an admission of dumb need, of inarticulate gratitude, and for me anyway, comes with a promiscuous willingness to go along with whatever half-baked theology might allow me to keep company with the friend. And he wrote about James P. Carse, the author of Finite and Infinite Games, which is a book that keeps coming up for me just now from different directions, who says about prayer that what matters is only that we speak from the heart. When we speak from the heart, we are speaking to God, Carse writes, and that such speaking can only happen at all by virtue of the silence that precedes it and receives it silently. And that takes me to an invitation that came in. For anyone who was listening to last week's episode and who feels the pull of what we were talking about with getting on your knees, but might not know where to start, my friend Vanessa, who's an artist and theologian and wonderful human being, holds a little online gathering each day called Stillness at 7. And it's something that started like this podcast in the early days of the pandemic. It happens at 7 in the evening UK time for a few minutes. And it's a quiet time for anyone, whatever you do or don't believe, whether or not you normally pray, to come together and just spend a few minutes silently giving thanks and asking for help and hoping for transformation. And you won't find Stillness at 7 on social media. But if you drop us an email at thegreathumbling@gmail.com, then I'll make sure that we send you the details for that. So have you been hearing from people since last week, Ed?
Yeah, there's a few responses, but there's one that I was just going to pick out, which was actually from my friend Candy Godbold, who is a convert to Islam, and she was particularly struck by the stuff that you mentioned from beloved Sarah Zoltash. And she said, she's radical. And she said, if a person doesn't pray the taught way or adhere to particular ideals of family or sexuality, can that person really call themselves a Muslim? And Candy said, well, I agree with Sarah, and I say yes. And she said she found it a very profound provocation, and I think Sarah's probably definitely got another follower.
Well, that's lovely to hear. I had a really nice message from Sarah during the week, and she posted a great photo of herself sitting down to listen to the two of us talking about prayer. So it's really cool to be connecting people to voices coming from different traditions. I wanted to share one more response that I got, some words from Ricardo, who is taking part in the current Homeward Bound series, and who wrote to me after last week's episode. And he says, I was raised as a Catholic, and like most of us during the teenage years, I drifted away. There was no space nor acceptance inside of the church for me as a gay man. And with adulthood came the realization that spirituality and institutionalized religion are two very different things. Prayer has become an essential part of my life, and it comes in so many different shapes and forms. Sometimes it's staring at the clouds. At others, it's running my fingers through rosary beads or reading medieval theology texts. Often it's just sitting down and looking to my thoughts as wind ripples across water. What hit me there reading Ricardo's mail was that in the past, when I've heard people make that distinction between spirituality on the one hand and institutionalized religion on the other, it often seemed to come with a turning away from anything that might smell of religion, and especially of church. So I find it striking that, anecdotally at least, I see more people these days claiming elements and practices of a faith tradition that they grew up in. The rosary, or the medieval theological texts, or the call to prayer, differentiating those from the institutional authority. I think this is what Gordon from Rune Soup calls jailbreaking our traditions, rather than just abandoning them. And also, reading Ricardo's mail and other messages we got this week, it's made me think about how we make space for the conversations that we're opening up with this podcast. Because it feels like we probably need something more thought out than just comments on a Facebook post, as a place where other voices can join in and pick up the threads of these conversations and take them in directions we might not have thought of. So I guess I want to come back to that a little before the end of this episode.
It's probably about time that we do the reveal about what the final move in this series of new moves is going to be. And I'm going to defer the honours to you, Dougald. What's going to be our ultimate instruction?
Well, it's been quite a workout. We kept it foolish. We moved our asses and other beasts of burden. We were like water. We did shrooms. Mum, if you're listening, no illegal substances were consumed in the making of this series, I promise. We saw double. We smalled ourselves up. We got on our knees. So what's left after all that? Well, it's the last instruction of any good workout. Now breathe.
I feel a little bit exhausted just thinking about all the adventures we've been on over the last couple of months. And actually it's the last 14 months, but I feel that familiar mixture of sort of metaphorically sweaty exhaustion, like I'm collapsed on the mat after the mother of all workouts and gasping a little for air. Yeah, at the same time, those endorphins are already kicking in for that mild state of ecstasy.
Yeah, it feels like it's time to cool off and catch our breaths and maybe look back over where we've been. So last year, we started out recording these conversations as things were going into lockdown. And we were talking about all of the stories swirling around the pandemic, the rush to fit a story to what was going on. And now there's this sense of cautious easing, maybe a sense that we can breathe out and relax a little, dare to think that we might be emerging out the far side of this. And you know, my parents drove up from Wisbech to County Durham, where they used to live, to stay with my aunt and see some of their old friends last week. And that feels like this big, brilliant news. My in-laws came the week before and stayed the night here at our new house. And it was the first really warm day of the year. And we found an old trestle table in the red house and set it up and ate dinner on the drive. And the cherry trees were just coming into blossom. And I felt euphoric. Like, there is this euphoria in these small, beautiful things that we've not been able to do for so long. That's part of the moment that we're in right now.
Yeah, it really is those tiny, simple, wonderful things, isn't it? The sparkle in the eye when meeting IRL, and the very fact that, you know, IRL in real life is now a familiar acronym says it all, doesn't it? And, you know, the physical embrace of a tight hug, which gets the old oxytocin flowing again. And in actual fact, it's a sort of sense of the effervescent gratitude and appreciation for all that we, you know, quite literally took for granted before.
So I guess that's part of what I'm wondering with this episode, is how to approach this moment. Because I also see some rightful disappointment. Like, I read a piece from the folks at the think tank Compass writing about how Build Back Better went from a call that they made last year for a radical progressive alliance to seize the moment of the pandemic to a slogan on Boris Johnson's podium. And I heard Sam Conniff saying he fears our generation's greatest regret will be that we failed to seize this moment.
Oof. Yes. Well, that's a sobering slap around the face right there, isn't it? I've lost track of the number of times various commentators have claimed the public just don't want to know about bad news right now. You know, they want any semblance of so-called normality at any cost, which is possibly, or perhaps even probably, in defiance of actual reality.
Right. Yeah. I mean, another friend whose judgment I trust voiced his concern when we spoke the other day that we're not out of this yet, or at all. And that conversation made me think of the series of narratives that have been picked up and then abandoned about how soon it would all be over. You know, lockdown was going to last a few weeks, and then Britain was going to be back fighting back against the virus within 12 weeks or whatever it was the first time around. Like here in Sweden, there was this sense of, you know, we'll get to the summer and then it'll all be over. And then it was, we'll get to Christmas and then we'll be able to relax. And it's like, I think maybe for many of us, whatever the truth of where we're at now, there is a kind of caution around putting too much faith in the promise of the vaccines, because we've been through a series of those kind of wishful thinking stories about when it was all going to be over. And at the same time, there's so much hope invested now in the vaccines. And this is what my friend was saying. What would the fallout be if the virus mutates and slips around those defenses? I think an escape variant is the technical term. How much would collapse if we get hit harder still? And what kind of political formations would fill the void? It ain't going to be transition towns, my friend was saying. Another friend talked about a conversation with her parents trying to bring some of this stuff up and how they just said, don't take away our hope.
Yeah, one of the favourite quotes of my fellow Futurenaut Mark Stevenson is Philip K. Dick's, where he says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away, which feels quite apposite right now. And it echoes one of my favourite quotes, which is actually from Ayn Rand, which has to be said is not our usual source of inspiration on this podcast. But in the literal sense of this episode, we're talking about breath and breathing. But Rand notes, you can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. And I think when we're told, for example, as we are now in the UK, that our cautious lockdown easing is irreversible, that should inevitably ring alarm bells and have us pausing for breath.
So I spoke in the first episode of this series about the Swedish official in the early weeks of the pandemic who said in a meeting, why are people dying in Italy? That's not a poor country. And I wonder if we're in another version of that kind of complacency now, because it feels like the story is, oh, there's horrible things going on in India and Brazil, but we've got it under control now in Europe, and half the adults in the United States are fully vaccinated. And so the pandemic is back to being categorized as a problem for poor countries again. And maybe that's true, Though if it is, it just emphasizes the scale of the challenge that's left. Talking about breathing, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism just ran an investigation that suggests that there are 19 countries in the world right now that face the potential collapse of their health systems due to a lack of oxygen supplies for hospitals resulting from the pandemic, including Argentina, Thailand, South Africa. So if you are sitting in a country where it feels like things are finally easing, I think I want to say you're right to breathe, to enjoy the breathing space, to feel the sweetness of those moments of euphoria, and just don't take it for granted. And within the space that this moment offers, some of us at least need to do what I gather Stoics call negative visualization, calmly considering the dark possibilities that are present within the situation, because we have no right to a happy ending. And, as I said at the end of the first series, that thing from Takrilik Partridge, the Inuit poet, where she says, consider the possibility that this is just the warning shots. So, even if we are out of the woods with the pandemic, even if we do have a great mobilization to spread vaccination in poorer countries and we do manage to get on top of the virus, there's another crisis coming along behind this one and another one behind that. And that's part of the reality, what Venkatesh Rao calls the great weirding that is characteristic of the times we're living in. And my friend said, it ain't going to be transition towns. It's going to be totalitarianism. And so maybe that's right. Maybe part of our negative visualization is to be seriously contemplating that kind of turn of events in the next few years. And so I want to ask what kind of things will be worth doing, possible to do, if that's the future that we find ourselves in.
My old friend Paul Dickinson once said something similar to me many years ago, actually, in the Earth Lodge at the Findhorn Foundation in Scotland. And we were sat around a fire with, as Martin Shaw would say, the smoke hole well and truly open. And Paul was talking gently, but darkly prophetically, perhaps in that negative visualization way, about the risk of totalitarianism inherent in dealing with real climate emergency. When governments and states consolidate control and demand sweeping power to do what needs to be done in the name of crisis. And, that echoed with me in a previous flicker of this. The BNP had turned up at a peak oil conference full of environmentalists, having strategically figured out that there was a nationalistic power play to be had from a critical resource crunch.
Right. Yeah. I wrote about this in the middle of the kind of earlier waves of Extinction Rebellion and when everyone was kind of organizing around climate emergency declarations, just saying, we need to be really clear about the political resonances of organizing around a call for a declaration of emergency, because the default version of what that means is a suspension of normal democratic processes. And so if that's not what we're asking for, then there needs to be a clear articulation of what emergency democracy might look like. One thing that came to mind for me this week was Elizabeth Oldfield from the Christian think tank Theos, who was part of last year's Homeward Bound series, and she introduced us to the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was part of the resistance against the Nazis. And there's an article by Laura Fabritzky, who has been a volunteer guide at the Bonhoeffer House in Berlin, where she talks about how when she first visited the house, she was looking to Bonhoeffer, she was looking for a hero of unassailable strength. And instead, what she found there in the stories that were being told moved her beyond that focus on the individual into the weave of relationships, family, friendship, civic involvement. And here's a bit of what she writes. How these fragile threads of relationship, unarmed, organized in and by love, and maintained through practices of committed belonging, not only significantly shaped Bonhoeffer's life and its trajectory, but also offered a moral counter-witness of their own. when Nazi ideology and policy quickly poisoned the civic and political well, these ties of belonging, seemingly weak in comparison to the jackbooted thuggery gaining steam around them, proved sustaining. And she quotes something that Eberhard Bethge, Bonhoeffer's best friend, had to say. And he called that house in Berlin one of the weak centres for the destabilisation of the Third Reich. So I'm thinking a lot just now about those weak centres of resistance, what practices, what moves we need to practice, how we attend to those fragile, seemingly weak threads of relationship.
It's funny when you mention transition towns, as I went on Rob Hopkins' podcast, What If, the other week, talking about the future of flight-free holidays. And, Rob's been a brilliant proponent for the resurrection of a sense of that creative public imagination. I don't know whether that's a weak centre of resistance, but that might enable us to collectively envision step changes in possibility and leap further and faster into positive change. But I know when you put your ill-fitting futurist hat on, Dougald, that someone has pulled onto your head, perhaps marginally against your own will, or maybe you've pulled it onto your own head, so unselfconsciously, but that you have a less than favourable view of some of that future-basing, head-stretching, visionary type process. But the point I want to make is that Rob is sort of half right, and perhaps we need that imagination of the possible in both light and dark ways, and maybe that's the negative visualization and the weak centre of resistance. And I read an interview with Bayo Akomolafe in the House of Beautiful Business's Beauty Shot newsletter this week, which helped me clarify some of that thinking and also take it to a different and perhaps deeper place. It goes back to that taking away our hope comment you shared just now. And Bayo asks, what if hope isn't the answer? And more importantly, what does not having hope allow us to see? And the interview touches on many of the themes that we dance across in our conversations, the coming back down to earth, the slowing down, and how the restless urge to fix and solutionize, when it's born from the same substrate of colonial mastery, often just exacerbates our problems, just makes them worse. But then he brings in this viscerally striking visual metaphor of the slave ship as the core representation of the way we still show up for work today. That the slave ship wasn't destroyed or composted on the shoreline at the end of the slave trade and emancipation. The shoreline became the slave ship. And with all those industrialized hierarchical structures, the power dynamics, and the inequities more or less intact. And Bayo says, we obviously can't resolve ideas of justice within the existing system by just bringing people out onto the upper deck, from the slave decks below. And he goes on to describe what acting beyond hope might look like, which again is some of the things we've touched on, the sitting with grief, the staying with the discomforting, troubled confusion and uncertainty, and not relying on visions of possibility that are extensions of today in some way, shape or form, but actually being genuinely radicalized by the chaos. And it was real food for thought. But my favourite part was his conclusion, where he's referring to his friendship with Charles Eisenstein and what really feeds and nourishes them both. And it's a theme which several people like Phoebe Tickell and Tony Spencer have also been talking about recently, and obviously a thread that we pull on. But he says poetry is the language of survival in a time of crisis. And when things get messy and muddy and uncertain and indeterminate, you call the poet. You don't call the scientist. You call the poet. It could be a businessman poet. Who knows? Or a scientist poet. Who knows? The world is hyphenated in strange ways. And that really struck with me, because I guess in some ways I'm a kind of scientist poet or consultant poet or recovering sustainability consultant poet, if we want to get into that. So here's to poetry and strange hyphenations.
Oh yeah. I saw Phoebe, who's one of my favourite scientist poets, posting about this the other day on Facebook, and Ed Superior from Newspeak House was like, I think most people never read another poem after they leave school. And I thought, yeah, most people's experience of school puts them off poetry, just like most people's experience of church puts them off prayer.
Exactly.
So something else from earlier in the series that I've been wanting to pick up on, the dark forest theory of the internet. Maybe you remember this, this kind of picture of what's going on, not in the big, bright, open spaces of the net, but in the quieter, harder to find, harder to navigate in corners, that might be where the life, the actual kind of thriving ecosystems are compared to the sort of poisoned water of the canals of Facebook and whatever else. So I found myself in the last week or so exploring Peter Lindbergh's project, The Stoa. We were just put in touch by a couple of mutual friends. And as I was exploring his journals, that led me to an article by Caroline Buster, developing the idea of the dark forests of the internet, wondering about where counterculture might exist today. And there was a great quote from that where she says, "So what does today's counter-hegemonic culture look like? It's not particularly interested in being seen, at least not in person. It gets no thrill out of wearing leather and a mohawk and walking past Main Street shops, which are empty now anyway. But it does demonstrate a hunger for freedom. Freedom from the attention economy, from atomization and the extractive logic of mainstream communication. We can imagine collectively held physical spaces reclaimed from empty retail, or abandoned venues hosting esoteric local scenes, a proliferation of digital gangs in dark forests who hold secrets dear, and a new desire for scarcity in cultural objects, deeper and closer connections made between people even while rejecting the platform's compulsion to like and share. In the internet era, true counterculture is difficult to see and even harder to find, but that doesn't mean it's not there." And this stuff has been really kind of coming together for me this week with the question that I think I've been asking all series about where the life is in the internet and in the ways people are using the internet these days. And this strong sense that the life is in the places where we reject the logic of the platforms. And it took me back to an essay from L.M. Sarkassus's newsletter that I've been thinking about a lot this spring. It's an essay called "Your Attention is Not a Resource." It's about what happens when we reject and what grounds we might have for rejecting the story about the attention economy and the scarcity of our attention. And he talks about those moments when we have exactly as much attention as we need, the quality of a particular kind of conversation that has that feel to it. And he says, you and I have exactly as much attention as we need at any given moment, provided that at that moment, we also know what it would be good for us to do. And something that comes through reading Peter's writings about his experience of being the steward of the Stoa, this strange, rather magical online space that he's been hosting over the past year or so, is this sense that he articulates almost in terms of minimum viable presence. So, like the lean startups, people talk about having your minimum viable product when you launch. So this is the idea of what you need might be the minimum viable presence on social media, on the clear net, in the big spaces of the internet. Not playing the game of those platforms, not even looking at the metrics for the number of people who are listening to this podcast or whatever it is, having just enough presence to help people find their way to the dark forests that you're taking responsibility for being a part of. And Peter says, you can have good dark forests and bad dark forests as well. There are different forms that this can take. But I felt reading this like it was describing something that I've stumbled into doing without having that much language for it. Because in a way, these long, slow podcasts we've been doing, they're kind of dark and foresty. And in the same way, when we're doing Homeward Bound, and we've got 120 people in 2 groups, meeting weekly over a couple of months, with various ways of being in touch between the weekly gatherings. Well, I definitely have a sense of sitting around a campfire together in a dark forest. And I suppose the other piece that interests me is something I've been tracking is the ability to make a living from operating on this kind of scale. And I think I learned this first from observing people like Martin Shaw and the School of Myth, and the idea that you might actually be able to build a small school where the number of people involved is small enough that things can be held in relationship rather than it just being transactional or about being a star on a stage in front of an audience of people who you don't know. I learned it as well from Steve Lawson, the solo bass player, and the way he writes about finding a relationship with his audience through playing house concerts. And Stuart Lee talking about folk musicians and this realization he had at a certain point as a stand-up comedian that actually you only need 5,000 people who are prepared to pay a tenner once a year to see you do the thing you're good at, and you can make a living off that rather than having to play the star system and focus on getting on TV and the rest of it. And I've been drawing together those threads this spring in this publication called Making a Living, Making a Life that I've been doing with the National Artists Association here in Sweden, which will be coming out in a few weeks' time. And I think the further part of this, at the risk of tempting fate, is I think that operating in this way can be healthy in a moment when what's often talked about as cancel culture is pervasive in the big spaces of the internet. Now, Ed, you talked last series about how you nearly got cancelled for posting a photo of a guy with his shirt off on a really hot summer day on the train on Twitter. That's nearly 2 years ago. So I'm kind of curious, has that had a lasting effect on your relationship with social media?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, after that experience, I am far, far, far more wary of what I post these days, because that was a genuinely foolish, fingers well and truly burned moment for me. I guess most of it, as you suggest, that I do now is in service to that low-level signalling to our dark forest. Whether that's the sort of flicker of a lantern through the trees or the blink of a lighthouse beam on a far shore. Although when I explore those visual metaphors, my inner marine biologist also thinks of the duality of that light in the darkness, however, because it could be the twitching lure of an anglerfish, which is so attractive, compelling and irresistible, and then yeah. To be honest though, I'm sort of more aggrieved by the broken relationship with some of my former Futerra colleagues and what feels like my subsequent cancellation. Because if I think about it from the heart, those were friendships and working partnerships that spanned decades. We worked and played together, almost like a family. And at times, it was a little bumpy, as any relationships that genuinely endure inevitably are, because we change through and perhaps because of them. But my own memories of those many years, and it was almost 18 years, were of joy and love, and that belief that we were all wholeheartedly committed to working together on things we felt were important, were at least a little influential, and that hopefully inspired others. And I think, certainly for me, the trust inherent in that was implicit. And that business that I co-founded, it just turned 20 years old. And it feels very, very odd to leave that monumental milestone unmarked. And I can't talk about my departure actually in any detail for obvious legal reasons, but I think I can say it was a debacle. And to say it was a debacle doesn't even begin to touch the surface. But the reason I mention this now, apart from that 20-year anniversary, is that sense of being cancelled that you just alluded to. Because after my expulsion, my name and photo were quietly removed from the website. And I haven't actually spoken to my colleagues in over 2.5 years, despite making several sort of tentative attempts at moving towards some form of resolution and reconciliation. And it's a bit like being told that you didn't exist, that all of those many years of graft and effort and risk were meaningless, that all the absolute love I poured into that company counted ultimately for nothing. Nada, zilch. And I'd worked my arse off during those crazy formative years of a startup and beyond. You know, we all had. And it was personal. I'd welcomed the team into my family home for away days several times. Me, my mother and my late brother had all catered for dozens of Futera events. You know, I put my flat up as collateral against company loans. I went a whole year without drawing a salary once. You know, I'd literally put my soul into that business, which, you know, perhaps was a rash thing to do in hindsight, but, you know, regret real. And one of the weirdest aspects is the cancel culture of social media presence, or lack thereof. You know, not in that classic sense, but in the grey block of being absolutely, completely and resolutely ignored. You know, my current work and everything I've done have never been noted, observed or acknowledged, let alone shared by the business I co-founded and co-built. You know, and at best that's a bit of historical revisionism. And worse, it's an erasing of most of my adult working life. You know, it's that feeling of being like the ghost at the feast, or he who shall not be named. And because my leaving was untrumpeted, but slipped out like a bad fart, sort of, you know, silent but deadly, many people still think I work there. I mean, I had an approach on LinkedIn just yesterday. Someone was saying, I'm interested to talk to you about Futera. So I replied saying, I haven't worked there in almost 3 years. You know, and this is, I want to make it really clear, this is absolutely not about bitterness or blame or finger pointing. You know, I've had to own in the hardest sense my own shortcomings through it all. So I'm in no position to cry, j'accuse. You know, I mention it more as a sense of overwhelming sadness in, you know, our theme of humbling. And in the context of this episode, the deep breath here is a weary sigh, because the door's been locked on me and it seems no matter what I do, it will remain so. So it's like a very painful divorce, which once it enters the arena of the legal can seemingly only go one way. And the cancellation is therefore as much a sort of coping mechanism that, as anything else, that avoids actually having to confront the real hurt and pain that lies underneath.
Yeah, listening to you talk about that, Ed, gives me a whole other sense of why it's been important to you to gather around and talk about this question of humbling over these like 24 episodes now. And I was thinking as I was listening of Rich Bartlett's piece on leaving the Church of Social Justice. And, you know, he's followed that up now with a new one on what he calls metamodern social justice. So there's a reconciliation going on there as well. But the thing that I found helpful in his original piece was, he says, you know, I no longer find my accountability in the opinions of strangers on the internet.
Yeah.
And so, like, some strangers trying to get you cancelled because you took a photo of a guy who took off his shirt on a train, like, it can be practically scary if you get caught up in one of those moments. But it's absolutely, you know, compared to the pain of people you've actually worked closely with, just sort of writing you out of the story.
Yeah.
The one puts the other into perspective. And I suppose the thing that I was reaching towards with noting that, you know, the ability, which I think I learned from Martin and have kind of put into practice a bit with home, to find ways of making a living that are embedded in relationship and that are operating on a small enough scale that you don't need to have a massive social media following in order to be able to make it work. I feel like you're vulnerable to, just at the practical level, you're vulnerable to being quote unquote cancelled if you have one employer who can be panicked by a bunch of loud voices over a couple of days on social media, or if you have a big mainstream publisher and where, like, in the interests of their reputation, they can drop you and that's a major crisis for you. If the way you make your living is actually through, you know, hundreds of people who make their own judgments about whether they want to, you know, buy your book directly from you, like Martin does with Sister Mystica, or whether they want to come on a Homeward Bound course. Like, at some level, you are not vulnerable in the same way. And also, if you don't have to if you don't have to be going chasing hundreds of thousands of YouTube followers, I think you can kind of be not worth cancelling. I feel like that's sort of part of what I've stumbled into trying to do.
And in a way, it's the definition of resilience, isn't it? Because that resilience comes from that more intimate relational context. The thing you're touching on there is the bit that strikes me is that's the root of genuine resilience. So,
cancel culture is a real thing, and I think it has to do with the dynamics of these platforms, the behaviours and vortexes of emotion and neurobiological reward that swirl up on Twitter and, well, mostly on Twitter, to be honest. And coming back to Peter Lindbergh, he had an interesting piece that I found on describing and sort of mapping the culture war battlefronts, where he says one of these is to do with this kind of woke and anti-woke thing. And he talks about there being an anti-woke cottage industry and how it relies on, as Peter says, what philosopher Robert Tallis calls the weak man fallacy. This is the fallacy when somebody picks on the weakest aspect of a group, usually a person that represents it badly, and uses them to dismiss the entire movement or philosophy. And I found that a helpful description because I get a bit exasperated when I see people recycling the talking points of the anti-woke cottage industry. And I just know they've never listened to, for example, the Finding Our Way podcast by Prentice Hemphill that I was bigging up last week. So we think we're talking about the same thing, but their experience of it is so different to mine. And what struck me, putting this together with those thoughts about the dark forest, is that what matters most about the stuff that's dismissively grouped under the heading of woke might be precisely the bit that gets lost or becomes illegible in the large-scale, low-context, high-speed environment of the Twitters. And what brought this into focus for me this week was an essay that Vanessa Andreotti sent me by Melissa Fruxachart, writing in the Boston Review. She's reviewing a set of books that represent, as the title of the article puts it, the literature of white liberalism. So this is what she calls the new genre of anti-racist non-fiction by black writers, but primarily being read by white people, that jumped to the top of bestseller lists a year or so ago in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the new wave of Black Lives Matter protests. And it's a nuanced review encompassing the limits of this genre and of what Fruxachart calls the long tradition of white people thinking they can read their way out of trouble. But what I found most interesting is where she gets to towards the end, talking about the critiques that you get from both right and left of a book like Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. So Fruxachart says, while it is predictable that those on the right would take this tack, it's intriguing that so many left reviewers of White Fragility refuse to recognize its potential for cultivating radical relationality. To dismiss the cultivation of emotional awareness as New Age indulgence mischaracterizes relational work as depoliticized personal work, and wrongly suggests that such relational work is unnecessary to building progressive or radical futures. And she quotes Angela Davis, who wrote this in 2016. I think our notions of what counts as radical have changed over time. Self-care and healing and attention to the body and the spiritual dimension. All of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles. That wasn't the case before. And I think that now we're thinking deeply about the connection between the interior life and what happens in the social world. And Fruxachart goes on. Healing justice engages things like the arts, sex, pleasure, rest, and ancestral wisdom as embodied modes of community building and cellular transformation that allow for reflection and growth in social movements. Pioneered in the past few decades by coalitions of Black, Indigenous, queer, trans, and women of colour, tenets of healing justice and transformative justice have emerged as guiding lights in the wake of the pandemic and the 2020 uprisings. So, running through this is an argument about the role of the relational and the embodied the metaphysical and, in Enlightenment terms, the irrational within politics and the possibility of change, where both on the right and the left, there's an unwillingness to let these things in, to grant them legitimacy. And what strikes me is that some of the verbal violence of the culture war, as it plays out in spaces like Twitter, is because these versions of the internet are just by their nature not spaces that have room for the relational, for the embodied, for slowing down rather than accelerating. So much of the heart of what matters about these movements is never going to come through if your idea of them is based on what mostly goes on in those kinds of online spaces. It's like the thing I've talked about before of the road, where you can no longer have that complex interweaving of horses and trams and children playing and people wandering along having conversations, because now you've got cars coming through fast and everything else has to get out of the way or get mown down. In fact, I'd say Twitter is not a space in which the relational is likely to flourish or even survive, any more than the motorway is a space where children can play. But if you're lucky and if you're curious, rather than being too quick to react, you might notice the minimum viable presence in those high-speed spaces of people whose work in quieter corners embodies this slower, relational work. You might spot the sign pointing off the motorway and find yourself somewhere more interesting.
And that's really powerful, because there's something around the fact that COVID has been the very real taking of our breath. And I mean that in the sense of the breathtaking speed, the pace and the urgency and the immediacy. And in the context of what you're saying there about the kind of the lack of opportunity for the relational and embodied, I mean, a lot of the leaders I work with are all saying one of their big concerns is that the sort of flat out breakneck pace at which a lot of them have been working, particularly if they've worked in areas associated directly with the health sector, is being sustained, you know, in the supposed emergence from the pandemic, that, you know, there's even less opportunity for relational and embodied work. And that idea of rapidly stolen breath comes up against those things that actually slowly and gently take our breath away because of their perhaps profound and surprising beauty. It's like we're kind of gasping for shallow breath rather than deep breathing down into the diaphragm, which comes back to what you said right at the beginning. What depths are we failing to deny oxygen to? And I think in some ways it feels like we're sort of metaphorically living on a mechanical ventilator right now. Maybe that's the machine we talked about in terms of EM Forster, and we've forgotten or lost that ability to embrace a more natural style of breathing. And for me, these conversations have been like a shared breath, a chance to get some air in which we take it in turns to inhale and exhale our thoughts together. But also how, in some ways, the relative breathless intensity of our recording, an episode every week for 2 months, can also leave us gasping a little, because there's so much richness to reflect and ruminate on. We don't always get the chance or the space and time to do that in a way that we might feel does it the appropriate justice. But I'm still grateful for the fact that we've now achieved, as you say, 24 episodes. It feels like quite a lot of content that we've been generating. So my final thought, perhaps for the end of season 3, is from Alan Watts, and it's about the backwards law, which basically states that wanting positive experience is a negative experience, and accepting negative experience is a positive experience. And that sounds counterintuitive. That's why it's called the backwards law. But it basically means that the more you pursue feeling better all the time, the less satisfied you become, because pursuing something only reinforces the fact that you lack it in the first place. I thought there's something really potent in there in regard to hope and humility.
Yeah, that feels like a good thought to be laying down there as we wind up this third series. I guess I wanted to just take a moment to lay a few breadcrumbs to say that, you know, beyond the end of this series, I'm going to be taking some time to think about what's coming next and how this evolves, and where the Great Humbling belongs within the ecosystem of this little dark forest that also includes Homeward Bound and the stuff that we're doing here physically at the school, and also how this might evolve in a way that serves as a platform for other voices and as a place to meet, a place to find each other, to find the others, maybe. But yeah, I just want to say, thanks, Ed, because it was your invitation. It was you taking up that phrase about the humbling that I'd been talking about every now and then for a while, and writing about it, and then writing to me and saying, why don't we just try recording a podcast? That's how we found ourselves here. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, thank you for helping me to stay humble, Mr. Hine.
Well, I think it's probably like a work in progress for all of us. I guess that in itself means that we'll be back for another series before too long. Meanwhile, let's end on a poem. And this is one that was read to me this morning by Deepa Patel. It's by Roshani Ria, and it's called The Unbroken. And it feels like a good place to land this series. There is a brokenness out of which comes the unbroken. A shatteredness out of which blooms the unshatterable. There is a sorrow beyond all grief which leads to joy, and a fragility out of whose depths emerges strength. There is a hollow space too vast for words, through which we pass with each loss, out of whose darkness we are sanctioned into being. There is a cry deeper than all sound, whose serrated edges cut the heart, as we break open to the place inside which is unbreakable and whole, while learning to sing. Thank you for listening to The Great Humbling. If you're new to the podcast, we'd invite you to check out the journey we've been on over the earlier episodes. In Series 1, we explored the sense-making stories taking shape through the first months of the pandemic, and Series 2 tracked the altered states of consciousness, being and feeling that we were seeing around us. This is an open-ended process, and we're keen to hear from you. So please do comment, ask questions, and respond via our Facebook page, The Great Humbling, or on Twitter, where Ed is @FruCool. We're grateful to all of you who've been giving ratings, reviews, and recommendations and sharing this podcast along your networks. And if you want to get deeper into the territory we explore in these conversations, do check out aschoolcalledhome.org, where you can sign up for live online courses and events. These are extraordinary times, a moment of initiation at a cultural scale. So thank you for being with us on this emergent journey.